Walter Bramble and the Little Museum of Everyday Things, a gentle bedtime story in 3 chapters. Chapter 1. The Museum Behind the Blue Door. Walter Bramble first noticed the blue door on a Wednesday morning in early October. He had passed it many times before without giving it much thought. It stood halfway along Cobbler's Lane, between an old bakery and a narrow passageway that led towards the churchyard. The paint was faded, the brass handle had lost its shine, and above it hung a small wooden sign. Walter stopped to read it. The Brambleford Museum of Everyday Things. Beneath, in smaller letters, someone had added, "Open Wednesdays, 10 until 4. Admission free." Walter looked through the window beside the door. Inside, he could make out shelves, glass cases, and several lamps glowing warmly against the dimness. He had lived in Brambleford for nearly 30 years and had never once entered. This surprised him. Walter was not a man who ignored small museums. He particularly liked the sort housed in old cottages, former schoolrooms, and rooms above village shops. They tended to contain things that larger museums did not consider important enough to keep: old buttons, tin toys, shopping lists, broken spectacles, objects which had spent most of their lives sitting quietly in drawers. Walter pressed the brass handle and went inside. A small bell rang above the door. The room smelled faintly of beeswax, paper, and old wood. Behind a desk sat a woman with silver hair tied neatly at the back. She wore a green cardigan and was writing on a catalogue card with a fountain pen. She looked up. "Good morning." "Good morning," said Walter. "I'm afraid I've walked past your museum for years." "Most people do." She said this without annoyance. "My name is Clara Wren." "Walter Bramble." Clara closed the catalogue box. "Have you come to see anything in particular?" "I didn't know there was anything in particular to see." "That is usually the best way to begin." She pointed towards the first display case. It contained 6 ordinary objects: a wooden spoon, a pair of gardening gloves, a bus ticket, a small alarm clock, a child's red mitten, and a blue and white china cup with a crack down one side. Walter leaned closer. There were no dates, prices, or historical explanations beneath them. Instead, each object had a handwritten card. The card beneath the wooden spoon read, "Used by Elsie Ward every Sunday for 42 years to stir gravy for her family. Donated by her daughter." Walter moved to the gardening gloves. "Belong to Arthur Bell, who grew sweet peas beside Brambleford allotments. He wore the same pair until the fingertips disappeared." The bus ticket had been kept by a woman named Margaret. It marked the journey on which she first met her husband. The alarm clock had once rung every morning at 5:30 in the cottage of a village milkman. The red mitten had been found after the snowy winter of 1963 and never claimed. Walter paused beside the cracked china cup. "Used by Thomas Reed during his final year at Brambleford Railway signal box. He always said tea tasted better from a damaged cup." Walter smiled. "These are not valuable objects," he said. "No," Clara replied. "That is the point." She left her desk and joined him. Valuable things usually look after themselves. They are insured, catalogued, and passed carefully from one person to another. She nodded towards the display case. Ordinary things are more vulnerable, because people throw them away, or forget why they mattered. They walked into the next room. It had once been the parlour of the house. A fireplace remained beneath the window, and an old clock ticked softly on the mantelpiece. The walls were covered with shelves. One held spectacles in leather cases. Another contained purses, notebooks, and keys. A large glass cabinet displayed kitchen objects: a flour scoop, a rolling pin, a potato masher, and a dented biscuit tin. Walter stopped beside the tin. It was painted with faded red roses. The card read, "The Christmas Biscuit Tin of Edith Parnell. Hidden on the top shelf each December because her grandchildren always found it too quickly." Walter could picture the scene at once. Children dragging chairs across a kitchen floor. A grandmother pretending not to notice. The careful lifting of a lid. The smell of shortbread and ginger. "It is strange," he said, "how quickly an object becomes a whole room." Clara nodded. "That is why the museum exists." She explained that it had been founded by her father, Edwin Wren, a retired schoolmaster. He had begun collecting objects after clearing his own parents' house. Everything useful had been given away. Everything valuable had been sold. But at the bottom of one drawer, Edwin found a small brass button from his mother's winter coat. He remembered holding it as a child, Clara said. Whenever they crossed the road, he would grip that button rather than her hand. Walter looked at her. He kept it. For the rest of his life. The button became the first item in the museum. At first, Edwin kept objects in boxes at home. Then neighbours began bringing him things they could not quite bear to discard. A baker's apron, a school satchel, a theatre ticket, a wooden ruler with a child's name scratched into it. When the old cobbler's shop became empty, Edwin rented the 2 front rooms. He opened the museum 28 years ago, Clara said. Did many people come? Not many, but the right people did. Walter liked that answer. Clara showed him a display of letters and postcards. One postcard had never been sent. It showed the seaside at Seabourne, with bright bathing tents and a crowded promenade. On the back, someone had written, "Dear Mum, the sea is colder than I expected, but I have paddled anyway." No address had been added. No stamp had been attached. "Who wrote it?" Walter asked. "We don't know." "Then why keep it?" "Because someone once stood beside the sea and thought of home." Walter read the message again. The museum was filled with such small moments. A grocery list from 1974. Bread, tea, soap, cat food, candles. Beside it was a note explaining that it had been found in the pocket of a coat donated to a charity shop. There was a library card with only one book stamped upon it. a glass marble discovered beneath the floorboards of the village school, a wedding shoe repaired with cardboard, a jar of buttons sorted by colour. Nothing would have attracted attention at an auction. Yet Walter found himself moving slowly from case to case. Each object seemed to ask him not to look at it, but through it, towards the kitchen where it had been used, the pocket where it had been carried, the hand that had held it. At the back of the second room stood a small wooden box with a slot in its lid. A sign above it read, "Do you have an everyday thing with a story?" Walter turned to Clara. "Do people still donate?" "Occasionally." "What sort of things?" "Usually objects connected to someone who has died. Families bring them because throwing them away feels wrong." She glanced towards the desk. "Though we cannot accept everything." "I imagine you would soon run out of space." "We already have." Clara led him through a curtain into a narrow passage. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling, crowded with labelled boxes. Purses and wallets. Kitchen drawer, objects, personal. Letters, tools, unmatched gloves. Walter looked at the last label. "You have an entire box of unmatched gloves." 3 boxes. I had no idea the village had lost so many. People are remarkably careless with gloves. At the end of the passage they entered a small room overlooking a courtyard. A kettle stood on a table beside 2 cups. Clara offered Walter tea. They sat beside the window. In the courtyard, rain had begun to darken the paving stones. "Will the museum remain open?" Walter asked. Clara stirred her tea. "For now." There was something in her voice. "Is there a difficulty?" "The lease ends in December." "And after that?" "The owner plans to sell the building." Walter looked back towards the shelves. "Could the museum move?" "Possibly. But moving a museum is not as simple as moving furniture." She gave a small smile. "There are more than 2,000 objects." 2,000. And every one has a record, a story, and in many cases, a family agreement attached to it. Walter considered this. "Does the village know?" "Not yet." "Why not?" "I wanted to be certain before worrying people." The rain gathered strength. Drops ran down the courtyard window. Clara looked tired, Walter thought. Not merely from that morning, but from months of carrying a problem alone. "My father believed the museum mattered," she said. "I do too. But belief does not create storage space or pay rent." Walter said nothing for a moment. Then he asked, "May I see the brass button?" Clara looked surprised. "Yes, of course." She led him back to the first room. The button rested alone in a small square case. It was tarnished, slightly dented, and no larger than a penny. Its card read, "Brass coat button, belonging to Alice Wren. Held by her son Edwin whenever they crossed Brambleford High Street." The first object in the collection. Walter stood before it for a long time. The button did not tell the story of a famous person. It did not mark a battle, an invention, or an important date. It simply remembered the feeling of a child crossing a road beside his mother. Walter thought that was reason enough to keep almost anything. He turned to Clara. "Would you mind if I spoke to Mrs. Finch at the library?" "About the museum?" "Yes." "What could the library do?" "I don't know yet." Walter put on his coat. "But Mrs. Finch is extremely good at knowing what ought to be done before the rest of us have worked out that anything needs doing." Clara smiled. "In that case, speak to her." Walter opened the blue door. The bell rang above him. Outside, the rain had softened to a fine mist. He crossed the village square toward the library, thinking about brass buttons, cracked cups, and all the quiet objects that remained after their owners had gone. Behind him, Clara turned the sign in the museum window. Open. For the moment, at least, it still was. Chapter 2. The Stories in the Storeroom. Mrs. Finch listened without interrupting. She sat behind the library desk, her hands folded over a stack of returned books, while Walter described the museum, the collection, and the approaching end of the lease. When he finished, she removed her spectacles and polished them. "You have lived in Brambleford for almost 30 years, she said, "and only discovered this museum today." "Yes." "I'm disappointed in you." "So am I." Mrs. Finch replaced her spectacles. "I visited it once, years ago. Edwin Wren showed me a pencil box that had belonged to one of his pupils." "Then you understand why it matters." "I understand that many things matter. That does not necessarily make them easy to save." Walter nodded. "What do you suggest?" "First, we need to know precisely what Clara requires." They returned to the museum that afternoon. Clara seemed surprised to see them so soon. Mrs. Finch introduced herself, though they had met briefly years before. Within 10 minutes she had opened a notebook and begun asking questions. How large was the collection? Who owned the objects? Were any on loan? Was there a catalogue? How much notice had been given? Could the lease be extended? Had Clara approached the parish council? Walter watched admiringly. Mrs. Finch had a way of turning a worry into a list, and a list into something that could be managed. Clara brought out several ledgers. Every item had a number, description, donor's name, and short history. Some records went back nearly 3 decades. "This is very thorough," Mrs. Finch said. "My father was a schoolmaster." "That explains the handwriting." The 3 of them spent the afternoon in the storeroom. Walter carried boxes from the shelves while Clara checked their contents. Mrs. Finch made notes. The first box contained wallets and purses. One was a small green coin purse with a metal clasp. It had belonged to a woman named Doris Bell. "She used it for bus fare," Clara explained. "There was always exactly enough inside for the return journey to town, and 1 cup of tea." Another was a man's brown leather wallet, worn almost white at the corners. Inside remained a tiny photograph of a black and white terrier. "No money?" Walter asked. "None when it was donated. Only the dog. Perhaps that was the more important thing." The next box was labelled Pocket Objects. Walter lifted the lid. Inside were a penknife, several handkerchiefs, a pipe, a packet of mints, and a smooth grey stone. The stone had been carried for 30 years by a man named Harold Price. "He found it on his first holiday with his wife," Clara said. "After she died, he kept it in his coat pocket." Walter held the stone. It was unremarkable, rounded by the sea, cool and heavy in his palm, yet for Harold it had contained a beach, a holiday, and the presence of someone he had loved. Walter returned it carefully to its wrapping. A third box held spectacles, round frames, square frames, wire frames repaired with tape. One pair was missing a lens. Each carried a story: a seamstress who refused to replace hers because they had belonged to her mother, a schoolboy who sat on his during morning assembly, a village doctor who kept 3 pairs and could never find any of them. As the afternoon passed, Walter began to understand the scale of the museum. The objects themselves occupied space. Their stories occupied even more. They could not simply be packed and carried away. Each needed to remain connected to its card, its donor, and its meaning. At 4 o'clock, Clara locked the blue door. They continued working. The museum felt different after closing. Without visitors, the tick of the mantel clock seemed louder. Floorboards creaked as the building cooled. Rain tapped softly against the front window. Clara brought tea and a plate of currant buns. They sat among the boxes. Mrs. Finch examined her notes. "The parish council has an unused room above the old fire station." "Too small," Clara said. "The church hall has storage." "Too damp." "The library has an attic." Walter looked at Mrs. Finch. "You told me the ceiling would collapse if I put one more box up there." "That was before we were discussing a museum." "This ceiling will not know the difference." Mrs. Finch ignored him. "What about displaying only part of the collection and storing the remainder elsewhere?" "I have considered it," Clara said. "But storage costs money." Walter looked around. "Could people sponsor individual objects?" Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "A small annual amount. Enough to help with preservation and storage." Mrs. Finch nodded slowly. "A membership scheme." "The objects belong to the whole village," Walter continued. "Perhaps the village should help look after them." Clara rested her cup on a box. "I dislike asking people for money." "It would not only be money," Mrs. Finch said. "Volunteers could catalogue, photograph, and pack." Walter added, "And perhaps people would value the museum more if they helped care for it." Clara remained uncertain. "My father never charged admission." "We are not suggesting that," Mrs. Finch said. "We are suggesting giving people a chance to become involved." They agreed to hold an open afternoon. Nothing elaborate. Tea in the back room. A few notices around the village. Visitors would be invited to see objects not normally displayed and to share their own stories. Walter offered to write the notice. Mrs. Finch offered to rewrite it properly. The following Wednesday, the museum remained open until 7. Walter arrived early to move chairs. Mrs. Finch brought a guest book from the library. Clara placed several unusual objects on a long table. A tin whistle, a wooden shoe last, a shopping basket with one repaired handle, a bundle of old recipe cards, a child's raincoat. At first only 2 visitors came, then 4 more arrived. By 6 o'clock the front room was crowded. People wandered between the cases, pointing and remembering. An elderly woman recognized the blue and white cup. "That was Mr. Reed's," she said. "He worked with my father." A man in a wax jacket examined the gardening gloves. "Arthur Bell taught me to grow sweet peas." A young mother stopped beside the red mitten. "My daughter loses one every winter." "Keep the next one," Walter said. "It may become historically important." The woman laughed. Mrs. Finch stood beside the guest book, asking people to write down one object from their own lives that they would save. The answers filled several pages. A father's tape measure, a grandmother's mixing bowl, a child's first shoe, a chipped mug, a set of house keys, a wooden comb, a dog's collar. Walter read them quietly. Most people had at least one object that appeared worthless to everyone else. At 6:30, Clara lifted a small handbell. The room became quiet. She explained the museum's difficulty. There was no dramatic speech. She simply told the truth. The building would be sold. The collection needed a new home. Without help, the museum might close. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mr. Hargreaves, who owned the bakery next door, raised his hand. "My upstairs rooms are empty." Clara looked towards him. "They would not hold everything." "No, but they might hold some of it." A woman from the parish council offered to investigate grants. A retired carpenter volunteered to build storage shelves. 2 sixth-form students said they could photograph the collection. Someone suggested a fundraising tea. Someone else offered a van. Walter looked at Clara. Her expression had changed. The problem had not vanished, but it no longer belonged only to her. As the visitors began leaving, an elderly man remained beside the table. Walter had seen him in the village, but did not know his name. He wore a long brown coat and held a battered leather case. "I brought something," he said. Clara invited him to sit. He opened the case and removed a small silver alarm clock. Its glass was scratched. One hand was missing. "It belonged to my brother," he said. Clara fetched a blank record card. "What was his name?" "Stephen Moss." The man explained that Stephen had worked nights at the flour mill. The alarm clock woke him every evening at 9. After the mill closed, he continued winding it, though he no longer needed to. "When he died," the man said, "I kept it in a drawer." "Would you like to donate it?" Clara asked. He hesitated. "I thought I did." Walter understood. Giving away an object was not always the same as discarding it. Sometimes it felt like losing the person again. Clara pushed the clock gently back towards him. "You needn't decide today." The man looked relieved. "Could you write down its story anyway?" "Of course." Clara wrote carefully while he spoke. When she finished, she gave him a copy. The man placed the clock back in its case. "Perhaps I'll bring it another time." "Whenever you are ready." After he left, Walter helped stack the chairs. Clara stood beside the door. "I nearly accepted it," she said. "The clock?" "Yes." "But he wasn't ready." "No." She looked around the museum. "My father used to say the first duty of a museum was not collecting." "What was it?" "Understanding why something had been kept." Mrs. Finch closed the guest book. "Then your father was right." Outside, the village had grown dark. Light from the museum windows fell across the wet pavement. For the first time, Walter noticed several people stop to read the sign. Some even tried the door before realizing the museum had closed. The blue door no longer seemed invisible. Chapter 3. The Things We Choose to Keep. During the next month, Brambleford became unexpectedly interested in ordinary objects. The library displayed copies of the museum's record cards. The bakery sold small cakes shaped like buttons. The village newsletter printed a weekly feature called The Story of a Thing. The first article concerned Edith Parnell's Christmas biscuit tin. The second told the story of Thomas Reed's cracked cup. The third was about a brass key that no longer opened any known door. Nobody remembered what the key had belonged to. Nevertheless, it had been kept for 50 years in a kitchen drawer. Walter found that detail especially pleasing. Even objects could outlive their purpose without becoming entirely useless. Volunteers came to the museum each Wednesday. Some cleaned, some packed. Others entered records onto a computer provided by the parish council. Mrs. Finch supervised the cataloguing with great seriousness. Walter photographed objects beneath a lamp in the back room. His first picture of a wooden spoon was so badly angled that it appeared to be floating. Clara asked him to try again. By November, several possibilities had emerged. The owner of the old bakery had agreed to rent the rooms above the shop at a reduced rate. The parish council secured a small heritage grant. The library offered a permanent display case for rotating exhibits. It would not preserve the museum exactly as it had been. The blue door would close. The rooms would be divided. But the collection would remain in Brambleford. Clara struggled with this. "It will no longer be my father's museum," she said one afternoon. Walter was wrapping a set of pastry cutters in tissue paper. "Perhaps not." She looked at him. "That is not particularly comforting." "No." Walter folded the paper. "But your father's museum was never really the building." Clara said nothing. "It was the idea," Walter continued, "that ordinary lives deserved to be remembered." Clara looked towards the first display case. The brass button remained beneath its glass cover. "Ideas survive moving more easily than furniture," Walter said. Clara smiled faintly. "You have become very philosophical about packing boxes." "It is either that or complain about my back." The final day in the old building was set for the first Wednesday in December. The museum would close at 4. At 5, volunteers would begin carrying the packed collection next door. Clara decided that the final object displayed behind the blue door should be one newly donated. The elderly man with the alarm clock returned 2 days before closing. His name was Bernard Moss. He brought the leather case again. This time, when Clara asked whether he was certain, he nodded. "My brother would have liked people to know he never overslept." The clock received the final catalogue number assigned in the old building. Item 2008. Its card read, "Silver alarm clock belonging to Stephen Moss, night worker at Brambleford Flour Mill. Wound each evening for 37 years. Donated by his brother Bernard." Clara placed it beside her father's brass button, the first object and the last. On closing day, rain fell from morning until noon. Walter feared few people would come. Instead, visitors arrived carrying umbrellas, damp coats, and objects of their own. They did not necessarily donate them. They simply wanted to share. A woman brought her father's shoe brush. A boy showed Walter a toy bus that had belonged to his grandfather. Mrs. Finch arrived with a fountain pen. "This belonged to the first librarian who worked here after the war," she said. "Are you donating it?" "Certainly not. I am merely demonstrating that I understand the principle." Walter had brought something too. It was a small wooden ruler from his years as a schoolteacher. His name had been written on the back in faded black ink. The ruler had spent decades in his desk drawer. It had measured paper, drawn margins, and tapped gently against desks when pupils became noisy. Walter did not know whether it deserved a place in the museum. Clara held it. "Is there a story?" "Many small ones. That is usually enough." Walter filled in a donation form. The ruler became item 2009. Clara displayed it beside the alarm clock. At 3 o'clock, Mr. Hargreaves brought tea and buns from the bakery. People stood in the 2 little rooms, talking softly. Nobody made the afternoon feel like a funeral. That was important. The museum was changing, not disappearing. At 3:45, Clara rang the handbell. She thanked everyone who had visited, volunteered, donated, or remembered. Then she spoke about her father. Edwin Wren did not believe objects were important by themselves, she said. He believed people gave them importance by using them. She looked around the room. He also believed history was not only made by kings, soldiers, inventors, or famous names. It was made every morning in kitchens, workshops, gardens, classrooms, and shops. Walter glanced at his ruler. A wooden spoon can tell us how a family ate. A ticket can tell us where someone went. A glove can tell us how they worked. Clara paused. And sometimes a simple button can tell us how safe a child felt while crossing a road. The museum was silent. At 4 o'clock, she turned the sign in the window. Closed. Then she unlocked the door again. The moving began. Boxes passed from hand to hand, from the museum to the pavement, from the pavement to the bakery, up the narrow staircase, onto the newly built shelves. The work proceeded slowly and carefully. Walter carried light boxes. Mrs. Finch carried one clipboard and gave instructions to everyone else. Mr. Hargreaves provided more tea. By 7 o'clock, the old museum rooms were almost empty. The display cases stood open. Pale rectangles marked where pictures had hung. The mantel clock had been removed, leaving the room strangely quiet. Only the brass button remained. Clara had chosen to move it last. She lifted the little case with both hands. Walter opened the blue door for her. They crossed into Cobbler's Lane. The rain had stopped. Above them, the clouds had parted enough to reveal a few stars. Clara carried the first object from the old museum into its new home. The upstairs rooms above the bakery were warmer and brighter. Fresh shelves lined the walls. The collection was still mostly packed, but several display cases had already been arranged. The brass button took its place in the center. Beside it stood Stephen Moss's alarm clock and Walter's wooden ruler. First, last, and new beginning. 1 week later, the museum reopened. Its new entrance was through the bakery. Visitors climbed a narrow staircase beside the counter, accompanied by the smell of bread and cinnamon. The new sign read, the little museum of everyday things. Upstairs, the rooms were smaller. Only a fraction of the collection could be displayed at one time. But Clara discovered an advantage. The exhibits could now change each month. January would feature winter objects, hot water bottles, coal scuttles, woolen scarves. February would contain letters, cards, and small tokens of affection. March would focus on gardening tools and seed packets. The library's display case held a different museum object each fortnight. Mrs. Finch chose the first. It was the unsent seaside postcard. Dear Mum, the sea is colder than I expected, but I have paddled anyway. Walter visited the new museum on its opening morning. The blue door of the old building had been painted grey by its new owner. For a moment, Walter missed it. Then the bakery door opened. The little bell rang. Warm air and the smell of fresh bread drifted into the street. Clara stood at the top of the stairs. "Good morning, Walter." "Good morning. Have you come to see anything in particular?" Walter smiled. "I still think that is the wrong way to visit." He climbed the stairs. The museum was already filling with people. A child examined the box of marbles. An elderly couple stood beside the bus ticket where Margaret had met her husband. Bernard Moss was showing someone his brother's alarm clock. It woke him every evening at 9, he said. Never failed once. Walter found his wooden ruler in a case labelled "School Days." Clara had written the card, used by Walter Bramble during his years as a schoolteacher. Employed for measuring paper, drawing straight lines, and occasionally restoring order. Walter laughed. Mrs. Finch appeared beside him. "I suggested the final phrase." "I suspected you had." They moved into the next room. On one wall hung a new sign. Every object was once part of an ordinary day. No ordinary day is entirely unimportant. Walter read it twice. Outside, the church clock struck 11. Below, bread was being taken from the bakery ovens. A delivery van stopped in Cobbler's Lane. Someone laughed on the staircase. The museum had changed rooms, but its quiet work continued. It kept the things people had touched, the things they had used without thinking, the things that became precious only after the ordinary days had passed. Walter stood before Edwin Wren's brass button. He imagined a small boy holding it as he crossed a busy village street, a mother walking beside him, neither of them knowing that the moment would be remembered nearly a century later. Then Walter understood something. People often imagined memory as a grand room filled with important events. But perhaps it was more like Clara's museum, a collection of little things, a voice from the kitchen, the feel of a coat button, a particular cup, the sound of an alarm clock, a ruler lying in a desk drawer, small objects quietly holding the shape of a life. Walter descended the stairs and bought a loaf of bread. On his way home he passed the old blue door. He did not feel sad this time. The museum had not been left behind. It had simply carried its stories a few steps along the lane. And as Walter continued through Brambleford, with the warm loaf tucked beneath his arm, he began noticing the ordinary things around him. A bicycle leaning against a wall, a shopping basket in a doorway, a child's mitten on a garden fence, a cracked flower pot beside a cottage step. None looked important, but Walter knew better now. Every one of them belonged to a day. Every day belonged to a life. And every life, however quiet, left something worth remembering.